The cold bit through the leather of his gloves, a familiar, almost comforting sensation. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Brandt, at 24 years old with 41 confirmed kills painted in neat black crosses below his cockpit, scanned the endless blue above the English Channel. It was March 6, 1944, 10:17 hours. The air at 8,000 meters was so clear he felt he could see the curve of the Earth. His Focke-Wulf FW 190 Ammonus 8, wrote Dre, hummed with a steady, powerful rhythm, its BMW 801 radial engine a testament to German engineering precision. In his ears, the calm, slightly bored voice of his wingman, Unteroffizier Erich Vogel, crackled over the radio. "Anything, Karl. My fingers are becoming icicles." Brandt smiled, his breath fogging the inside of his oxygen mask. "Patience, Erich, the Jabos will come. They always do, looking for a target of opportunity, thinking they own the sky." He adjusted his grip on the stick, the aircraft responding with a slight, eager tremor. Today's mission was Frey Jagd, a fighter sweep over northern France. Hunting. It was what they did best. The Jagdwaffe still owned this slice of sky, or so every briefing, every after-action report, every night's cross ceremony insisted. Through his canopy, he glanced at the other 3 Focke-Wulfs of his swarm, holding a loose, combat-spaced formation. They were veterans all, survivors of the Eastern Front meat grinder and the deadly circus over the Reich. They knew their machines, knew each other's moves. And what they knew of their opponents, the American fighter pilots, painted a picture of competent but unexceptional foes. They flew sturdy, unglamorous aircraft, relied on brute force over finesse, and most importantly, lacked the killer instinct honed in 3 years of continuous combat. Or so the prevailing wisdom went. Brandt had tangled with the American Thunderbolts before, big, barrel-chested aircraft they called the Jug. He'd found them durable, yes, and heavily armed, but sluggish in a turning fight and easy to outclimb. A worthy adversary for a novice, perhaps, but not for an expert. What Brandt, and indeed the entire Luftwaffe Fighter Command, could not yet comprehend was that they were no longer hunting. They were the prey. The rules of the game had been rewritten in deafening factory halls thousands of miles away, and the first pages of the new manual were about to be delivered in a storm of 50 caliber fire. The confidence that filled Brandt's cockpit that morning was a relic, a beautiful, deadly illusion about to be shattered against the hard anvil of American industrial might. The foundation of this German confidence was, on the surface, rock solid. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was arguably the most battle-hardened force in the world. Pilots like Brandt had cut their teeth against the RAF's Spitfires in 1940, then been thrown into the vast, brutal expanses of the Eastern Front, where aerial battles involved hundreds of aircraft. The experience differential was staggering. A new American pilot arriving in England might have 300 hours total flight time, with perhaps 50 in his fighter. A German pilot of similar rank, if he survived his first 10 missions, would have over 500 combat hours. Tactics were refined to a science. The Schwarm 4 aircraft and Rot 2 aircraft formations pioneered by men like Werner Mölders provided flexible, mutually supportive fighting units that had dominated the skies for years. The intelligence picture reinforced this sense of superiority. Reports from the Abwehr and technical evaluations of captured or crashed Allied aircraft formed the basis of the Luftwaffe's understanding. They knew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American escort fighter in early 1944, intimately. Or so they believed. Technical manuals listed its specifications. A maximum speed of 690 km/h at altitude. A service ceiling of 12,800 meters, armed with 850 caliber machine guns. It was powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney RMS 2800 double Wasp engine. The German assessment was clinical. The Thunderbolt was a heavy Zersterer destroyer, excellent in a dive due to its weight, but a clumsy dogfighter. It could not climb with a FW-190 or turn with a BF-109. Its one trick was the boom and zoom attack, a high-speed pass from altitude. Avoid that initial pass, the doctrine taught, and the lumbering American would be vulnerable. This assessment was technically accurate. For 1942, it was a fossilized snapshot, completely missing the revolutionary upgrade that had transformed the aircraft. The intelligence apparatus, strained and often dismissive of frontline pilot reports, failed to grasp a critical truth. The P-47 they were briefing their pilots about no longer existed. Beneath the cold statistics lay a deeper, more pernicious layer of cultural and professional arrogance. Many senior Luftwaffe commanders, products of a military tradition that venerated individual heroism and tactical genius, held a dim view of American martial capabilities. The Yanks were seen as materialists, rich in resources but poor in spirit. Their pilots were well-fed, well-equipped boys, not hardened warriors. A widely circulated report from a captured American pilot interrogation, later proven to be exaggerated, stated that new USAAF pilots were taught to break off combat if they lost their wingman. To the Germans, this was proof of a lack of aggression, a lack of the Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feeling, that separated the ace from the amateur. This prejudice blinded them to a different kind of strength, systemic, relentless, and powered by an economy they could scarcely imagine. A few voices in the wilderness tried to sound the alarm. One was Major Hans Heinrich von Breuning, a staff officer with Luftwaffe Reich who had meticulously compiled loss reports from late 1943. He noticed an anomaly. The loss ratio against American fighters, once a comfortable 3-1 in favor of the Germans, was slipping. It was now 2-1, and in some engagements over the Reich itself, nearly 1-1. More disturbing were the narratives in the reports. Pilots spoke of thunderbolts climbing with them, staying with them in turns they should have won easily. They mentioned a strange, whistling sound from the American aircraft in a dive. Von Breuning wrote a memorandum in January 1944, suggesting the Americans might have fielded a significantly improved model of the P-47, possibly with a new engine or supercharger system. The response from the technical office in Berlin was dismissive. The Pratt & Whitney RMS-2800 is at the limits of its development potential, the reply stated. The described performance characteristics are aerodynamically improbable and likely the result of combat stress and misperception by our pilots. Von Breuning's report was filed away, marked for information. The men who would pay the price for that bureaucratic shrug were, at that very moment, flying patrols over France. What the German intelligence analysts had missed, what their cultural biases had prevented them from even considering, was not a minor tweak but an engineering revolution. The key was not in the engine itself, but in what sat behind it in the dark, cramped belly of the Thunderbolt. It was the GE Type C H-5 turbo supercharger. The story of this device is a story of American industrial genius at its most stubborn and brilliant. The problem was simple. Piston engines lose power as they climb because the air gets thinner. A supercharger, mechanically driven by the engine, forces more air into the cylinders, but it creates a parasitic drain on engine power, especially at higher altitudes. The turbo supercharger was a different beast. It used the engine's hot, fast-moving exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which in turn powered a centrifugal compressor that forced dense air into the engine. It was more efficient, and it allowed an engine to produce incredible power at altitudes where other fighters gasped. The concept wasn't new. General Electric had been working on it since the 1920s, but turning it into a reliable, compact, battle-ready unit was a nightmare of engineering. The turbine blades, spinning at over 20,000 RPM in a stream of searing exhaust, had to withstand temperatures that melted ordinary steel. The wastegate that regulated boost pressure had to respond instantly to throttle movements. Ducting the exhaust gases and compressed air through the airframe without causing drag or catastrophic heat buildup was a puzzle that stumped teams for years. The man who oversaw the integration of this system into the P-47 was Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant, driven Georgian-born aeronautical engineer at Republic Aviation. Kartveli's original design for the Thunderbolt was built around the turbo from the start. It was a radical approach. While other designers tried to add turbo superchargers as an afterthought, Kartveli designed the entire aircraft as a shell for its power plant. The turbo was mounted in the rear of the fuselage, with long, carefully engineered ducts running from the engine exhaust to spin it, and from the compressor back to the engine's intake. It was complex, heavy, and mechanically fraught. The first prototypes were plagued with failures. Turbo blades shattered, wastegates seized, and the ducting cracked under thermal stress. But Kartveli and the team at GE, led by engineers like Sanford Moss, refused to give up. They experimented with new nickel-chromium alloys for the turbines. They developed intricate bearing systems cooled by engine oil. They tested and failed and tested again in altitude chambers that simulated the bitter cold of 30,000 feet. This was the American approach, not the pursuit of a single, perfect prototype, but the relentless, iterative solving of problems through applied resources and manpower. While German engineers sought elegant, minimalist solutions, the American philosophy was one of overwhelming force applied to engineering challenges. If a part failed, they didn't just make a stronger one. They redesigned the system around it, adding redundancy, improving cooling, simplifying where they could. By mid-1943, they had cracked it. The P-47D, rolling off the Republic Assembly Line in Farmingdale, New York, and later in the colossal new plant in Evansville, Indiana, was not the same aircraft the Germans had in their manuals. The D model, with its paddle blade propeller and the finely tuned CH-5 turbo, was a monster. It could maintain over 2,000 horsepower at 9,000 meters, an altitude where a FW-190's engine was producing less than half that. Its top speed wasn't 690 km/h. It was over 755 km/h in level flight. And in a dive, with the turbo screaming and the airframe built like a bank vault, it could approach 885 km/h, becoming the fastest object in the sky. The whistling sound German pilots reported was the turbine spooling up, a sound they had never heard before because no other fighter in the world had such a system. And then there were the numbers. This is where German comprehension truly broke down. They thought in terms of squadrons. America thought in terms of floods. The Messerschmitt plant in Regensburg, under constant threat of bombing, might produce 80 Bf-109s in a good month. The Focke-Wulf plant in Marienburg could manage perhaps 120 FW-190s. Republic Aviation Farmingdale plant alone was producing 15 P-47s per day. The Evansville plant, a marvel of production line efficiency built from the ground up for this one aircraft, would soon match that. By March 1944, over 45 P-47Ds had already been built. The USAAF was not just replacing losses, it was expanding its fighter force exponentially. For every Focke-Wulf that rose to challenge them, 3, 4, or 5 Thunderbolts could be sent in response. The German pilot was a craftsman, honing his skill in a finely tuned instrument. The American pilot was becoming a component in a vast, automated system of destruction. The first, fragmentary hints of this new reality began to bleed into German consciousness in the winter of 1943–44. But like faint cracks in distant ice, they were easy to ignore until the whole sheet gave way. On December 11, 1943, Lieutenant Franz Hauser of JG-26 returned from a mission over the Dutch coast white-faced and shaking. During a messy engagement with a group of P-47s escorting B-17s, he had dived on one from a classic high-side position. The Thunderbolt, instead of trying to turn or dive away, had simply climbed. Hawser, flying a pristine new FW-190 Amanus 6, had pushed his throttle to the emergency war power setting, watching his manifold pressure gauge needle tremble at its limit. The American aircraft had pulled away from him, ascending as if he were standing still. He reported this to his Grupp intelligence officer. The report was logged with a note: LT. Hawser likely misjudged altitude and energy states. The P-47 cannot outclimb the FW-190. Recommend additional training on energy maneuverability theory. A week later, a more detailed report came from Oberfeldwebel Johann Schneider, a grizzled veteran with 58 kills. He'd been jumped by a single P-47 while on a low-level reconnaissance mission. He'd used the classic defensive maneuver for a heavier fighter, a hard, climbing turn. The Thunderbolt had stayed with him through 2 full turns, then had actually begun to gain an angle. Schneider had only escaped by diving to treetop level and using his aircraft's superior low-speed roll rate. His written statement was unequivocal. The aircraft I engaged was not the Thunderbolt we know. It was more responsive, and its climb rate was exceptional. It possessed a rate of roll at high speed that was superior to my own machine. This report made it to the desk of the Jeschwader Commodore, who scribbled in the margin, "Experienced pilots making excuses for poor situational awareness. The enemy does not have magic aircraft." The most compelling evidence came not from the Western Front, but from a twisted pile of metal in a field near Bremen. In late January 1944, a P-47D of the 56th Fighter Group, crippled by flak but its turbo system miraculously intact, made a forced landing. German recovery teams swarmed over it. For the first time, their engineers saw the CH-5 turbo supercharger installation up close. They measured the ducting, examined the turbine blades, and understood the basic principle. A preliminary technical report was rushed to Berlin. It warned that this technology gave the P-47 a decisive advantage in high-altitude performance, and recommended an urgent crash program to develop a comparable system for German fighters. But the German aviation industry was already stretched to breaking point, desperately trying to produce enough of the existing designs to stem the tide. Developing, testing, and mass-producing a whole new turbocharged fighter was a fantasy. The report's recommendation was acknowledged, then buried under priorities labeled Jägernaut Program. The emergency fighter program focused on producing vast numbers of simple, cheap interceptors like the He-162. The technical truth was recognized, then immediately discarded as impractical. The men in the cockpits would be left to face the consequences of that industrial impossibility. This collective denial was about to meet its day of reckoning. The stage was set for a confrontation that would tear the old certainties to shreds. April 8, 1944. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Brandt led his swarm of FW-190s on a patrol near the Belgian border, east of Dunkirk. The mission was routine: provide top cover for a pair of radar stations and intercept any low-level Allied fighter-bomber raids. The sun was high, glinting off the channel to the north. At 11:42 hours, the calm was broken by a call from ground control. Achtung, wrote leader. Bandon reported, vector 270, altitude 6,000 heading east, estimate 8 to 12 aircraft. Possibly Jabos, Brandt acknowledged, a flicker of predatory interest cutting through the boredom. Understood, wrote Schwarm, turning to 270, climb to 75-0. Let's get the sun behind us. He pushed the throttle forward, the BMW engine responding with a deeper roar, and began a gentle, fuel-efficient climb. 8 to 12 fighter-bombers, likely British Typhoons or American Thunderbolts on a ground attack sortie. Perfect. They'd be low, slow, and burdened with bombs or rockets, a classic bounce from altitude. He checked his wingman. Vogel was tucked in nicely to his right. The other two aircraft, flown by Feldwebel Hartmann and the young, eager Lieutenant Bauer, were slightly above and behind. A textbook swarm. As they climbed, Brandt's mind ran through the calculus. They had the altitude advantage. They had the sun. They had the tactical initiative. The only thing that gave him a moment's pause was the controller's identification. Bandits was a generic term, but the vector from the west and the altitude suggested they were coming from England. They were almost certainly allied. He pushed the thought aside. He had faced worse odds on the Eastern Front. At 72 meters he saw them, first as a cluster of dark specks against the patchwork of fields and rivers below, then resolving into distinct shapes. He counted quickly, 10 aircraft, flying in a loose, stacked formation. They were not in a bombing run, they were cruising. And they were not the bulky, blunt-nosed typhoons. The profile was familiar, yet somehow different. The deep, rounded fuselage, the elliptical wings, thunderbolts, but these looked sleeker. The canopies were different, a teardrop bubble instead of the old razorback fuselage. And they were clean. No bombs, no rockets. These were not jobos. These were fighters on a sweep. A hunter's mission just like his own. A faint, cold trickle of unease traced his spine. This was not the scenario he'd anticipated, but the numbers were still in his favor. 4 against 10 was not ideal, but with the advantage of altitude and surprise, it was more than workable. German fighter doctrine was built on the quality of the first attack. Hit hard, hit fast, score kills on the first pass, and then use superior energy to disengage and reset. Roach swarm bandits at 10 o'clock low, he transmitted, his voice calm and professional. 10 thunderbolts, clean configuration. We have the advantage. Follow me down. Hartmann, Bauer, take the left side of the formation. Vogel with me on the right. One pass, then climb back to altitude. Do not get drawn into a turning fight. Understood. A chorus of Verstanden clicked in his ears. He took a last look around the empty sky above and behind him. Nothing. The high blue was theirs. He rolled the Focke-Wulf onto its back, the horizon spinning, and pulled the stick back into his stomach. The dive was smooth, controlled, the airspeed needle beginning to quiver and then march steadily clockwise. 500 km/h, 550, 600. The thunderbolts grew larger in his sights. They still showed no sign of having seen him. Perfect. He picked his target, the rearmost aircraft on the right flank of the American formation. At 800 meters, he opened fire. The familiar shudder of his 2 MG-131 machine guns and 2 MG-151/20 cannons rattled the airframe. Tracers lanced out, converging on the unsuspecting thunderbolt. And then the world changed. The American formation didn't explode into panic. It didn't scatter. In a movement of chilling, drilled precision, the 10 aircraft broke in unison. Not a wild, defensive break, but a smooth, practiced maneuver. The target he'd picked pulled up into a steep, climbing turn to the right. Brandt, committed to his dive, shot past, his shells slicing through empty air. He cursed, pulling out of the dive and beginning a climbing turn to the left to regain his altitude advantage. He needed to reset. The bounce had failed. That's when he heard Vogel's voice, sharp with surprise. "Carl, they're climbing with us." Brandt glanced to his right. Vogel's FW-190 was clawing for altitude, its nose high. And right behind it, maybe 400 meters back and slightly below, was a thunderbolt. Not diving, not running, climbing. And it was gaining, not quickly but perceptibly. The sight was so fundamentally wrong it took Brandt's brain a second to process it. A thunderbolt could not do that. It was aerodynamically impossible. It violated the laws of physics as he knew them. "Brake right, Erich, now," he shouted. Vogel snapped his aircraft into a hard starboard turn. The thunderbolt followed, its turn radius visibly tighter than it should have been. Brandt, now in a shallow climb himself, saw 2 more of the American fighters curving around, not chasing Hartmann or Bauer, but positioning themselves to cut off his own climb path. The tactical picture, so clear and advantageous seconds ago, was dissolving into chaos. They were not fighting 10 individual aircraft. They were fighting a single, intelligent organism. Roach swarm abort. Climb to the east. Reform at 9,000, Brandt ordered, his voice tight. He firewalled the throttle, feeling the engine vibrate as it delivered maximum emergency power. He needed to get out of this kill zone, get back to the sanctuary of superior altitude. He focused on his instruments, watching the altimeter needle slowly unwind. 65-0, 67-0, 69-0 meters. The air was thin and cold. His FW-190 should be in its element here. He risked a glance over his shoulder. 2 Thunderbolts were behind him, not diving to catch him, but in a steady, relentless climb, matching his angle, holding the distance. The sight sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. They were not supposed to be here. This altitude was his domain. A new sound reached him, faint at first, then growing clearer over the roar of his own engine. A high-pitched, metallic whistle, like a boiling kettle heard from a distance. It was coming from the pursuing Americans. The sound German pilots had mentioned in those ignored reports. The radio, which had been quiet, now erupted. "This is Hartmann. I have one on my tail. I cannot shake him. He is staying with me in the climb." "Bauer, where are you?" Brandt snapped. "Below, 2 of them forced me down. They are fast in the dive, Carl. Unbelievably fast." Then Vogel's voice, strained and desperate. "He is still on me. I am at full power. He is gaining. What is this aircraft?" Brandt's mind raced, trying to process the sensory overload. The whistling sound. The impossible climb rates. The way they had anticipated his bounce. This was not the enemy he had trained to fight. The reports, the dismissed complaints from veterans like Hauser and Schneider, they weren't excuses. They were warnings. And he had ignored them just as his superiors had. He made a decision. All rote units break off independently, dive for the deck, use maximum speed and head for home base. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. It was a humiliating order, the antithesis of everything he'd been taught. But survival instinct, honed in dozens of battles, screamed that staying in this vertical fight was suicide. He rolled his FW-190 onto its wing and pulled the stick hard back, entering a near-vertical dive. The airframe shuddered as the speed built rapidly. 700 km/h, 750, 800. The ground rushed up in a blur of green and brown. This was his one remaining advantage. The FW-190 was a superb diving aircraft, stable and strong. No Thunderbolt, no matter how powerful, could follow him in a dive like this without its wings ripping off. He checked his mirror. Empty sky. A surge of relief washed over him. He'd outrun them. He began to ease back on the stick, the G-forces pushing him down into his seat as he pulled out of the dive at a heart-stoppingly low altitude, the treetops flashing past his wingtips. He was safe. He'd live to fight another day, to report what he'd seen. And then the whistling scream filled his ears again, louder now, a shrieking banshee wail that cut through the roar of his own engine. He looked left, and his blood turned to ice. A Thunderbolt was there, not behind him but beside him, slightly above, keeping perfect formation. It had not just followed him in the dive, it had caught him. As Brandt watched, frozen in disbelief, the American pilot, his features hidden behind an oxygen mask and goggles, turned his helmeted head and looked directly at him. Then, with a casual, almost contemptuous flick of his wing, the Thunderbolt rolled away and began to climb again, leaving Brandt staggering in its wake, his mind unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The aircraft had dived with him, matched his speed, and then, with what seemed like effortless reserve power, simply climbed away. It was a display of total energy superiority, a physical demonstration that every performance chart he'd ever studied was a lie. The radio was a cacophony of panic now. "They are everywhere. My engine is hit. I am losing power. Bauer is gone. I saw him go in. Vogel, Erich, answer me." Brandt's mouth was dry. He scanned the sky frantically. He saw a plume of black smoke marking a crash site far to the west. He saw two more thunderbolts, high and distant, circling like hawks. And then he saw them, not the 10 he had first engaged. More, many more. They were emerging from the high haze to the west, not in a neat formation but in a vast, loose swarm. He counted quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs. 15, 20, 30. They kept coming, a seemingly endless stream of silver specks catching the sun. It wasn't a squadron. It wasn't even a group. It was a wall of aircraft. In that moment, huddled low over the French countryside in his supposedly superior fighter, Karl-Heinz Brandt understood the terrifying truth. They weren't just facing new aircraft. They were facing a new kind of war. The reports hadn't been wrong. They had been catastrophically, fatally incomplete. The Americans hadn't just improved a plane. They had built an air force of monsters, and they were sending them over in numbers that defied belief. His swarm was not hunting. It was being systematically eradicated. A new voice, young and trembling, cut through the radio chaos. It was Lieutenant Bauer. He was alive. Wrote leader, I am at 3,000 heading 110. I have 1 no 2 on my tail. They are closing fast. I cannot, the engine will not. The transmission dissolved into a scream of static. Then, clear as a bell, a calm American voice speaking in English pierced the German frequency. Red 3, break left, he's all yours. Brandt looked up and saw it. A single thunderbolt, high above at maybe 9,000 meters, was tipping over into a dive. Not towards Bauer, towards him. The angle was steep, nearly vertical. The sun glinted off its bubble canopy. It was too far away for a firing pass. It was just diving, gaining speed. An absurd, wasteful maneuver, but the speed it gained was not absurd. It was horrifying. The whistling scream became a piercing shriek that seemed to tear the sky itself. The aircraft became a blur, a silver streak accelerating at a rate Brandt had never seen. In seconds, it had covered a distance that should have taken a minute. It wasn't just fast. It was rewriting the physics of aerial combat before his eyes. It pulled out of its dive not behind him, but in front of him, using its insane kinetic energy to zoom climb back to altitude in a maneuver that left his FW-190 feeling like a stationary target. The radio was silent now. No more cries for help. No more reports. Just the hiss of empty static and the all-consuming, demonic whistle of the diving thunderbolt that was now, impossibly, turning back for another pass. Brandt's hands were slick with sweat inside his gloves. He was alone. Vogel was gone. Hartmann was gone. Bauer was gone. The sky, which had been his kingdom, was now filled with silent, silver predators that operated on a different set of rules. He pushed the throttle to the stop, heading east, desperately seeking the sanctuary of the nearest flak battery. He weaved slightly, trying to present a difficult target. He glanced in his mirror every 2 seconds. For a moment he saw nothing. Hope, frail and desperate, flickered. Maybe he could outrun them. Maybe then he saw the flashes. Tiny, bright winks of orange light sparkling in the sunlight high above and behind him. Not one set. Multiple sets. 4, 5, 6 different aircraft, all firing at extreme range. The streams of tracers, 8 from each aircraft, converged in the sky around him not as individual lines, but as a solid, rippling curtain of lead. The Americans weren't bothering with careful aiming. They were saturating the airspace he occupied with a volume of fire that was mathematically impossible to evade. The 50 caliber bullets, traveling at over 800 meters per second, began to walk towards his aircraft. He could hear them now, a sound like ripping canvas, getting louder, closer. He jerked the stick hard right, then left, then right again, his body thrown against his harness. The tracers followed, the gunners above correcting with a speed that suggested they'd done this 100 times before. A hammer blow struck his left wing root. Then another. The Focke-Wulf shuddered violently. The engine note changed, developing a ragged, coughing sound. Black oil smeared across his windshield. A warning light for the oil pressure blinked on, a bright, accusing red eye on his instrument panel. He was hit. Badly. The whistling scream came again, closer this time from his right. He turned his head and saw it, another thunderbolt, lining up for a close-range shot. Its 8-gun ports in the wings were dark, hungry circles. The American pilot had him perfectly in his sights. Brant did the only thing he could. He slammed the stick forward and to the left, throwing his crippled aircraft into a desperate, rolling dive towards a bank of scattered cumulus clouds a few thousand feet below. It was his last card. As he spiraled down, the world a spinning vortex of blue sky and green earth, the last thing he heard over the screaming wind and the faltering roar of his engine was that same calm American voice from the radio, now chillingly close, as if the speaker were right beside him. "That's it, kid. Run home and tell them what you saw." The cloud bank enveloped him in a sudden, blinding whiteness. The world vanished, reduced to the shuddering instrument panel and the muffled roar of his dying engine. The oil pressure gauge needle had fallen to 0. The temperature gauge was pegged in the red. The BMW 801 radial, that masterpiece of precision engineering, was grinding itself to pieces. Metal fragments torn loose inside the crankcase were circulating with the remaining oil, scouring the bearings, sealing its fate. The vibration through the airframe was no longer a hum, it was a death rattle. Brant fought the controls, his muscles straining against the asymmetric drag from his damaged left wing. The Focke-Wulf wanted to roll and yaw to the left, pulling him into a fatal spin. He applied right rudder and aileron, his boots pressing against the pedals until his calves burned. The altimeter unwound. 1,500 meters, 1,200, 900. He had to get out of this dive before he tore the wings off or plowed into the French countryside. The cloud thinned, offering fleeting glimpses of forest and field, a church steeple, a winding road. There was no safe landing site, no friendly airfield within 50 kilometers. A decision crystallized in his mind, cold and clear. Bail out. It was the only option. But to bail out of a FW 190 at low altitude and high speed was a perilous gamble. The canopy was jettisoned by explosive charges. If he was too low, he wouldn't have time for his parachute to open. If he was too fast, the slipstream could smash him against the tailplane, breaking his back or tearing him apart. He had practiced the procedure a dozen times on the ground, never in reality. He reached up with his left hand, his fingers finding the red-painted lever above his head. He took one last look at the cockpit that had been his home for 2 years. The photograph of his parents, tucked beside the instrument panel. The 41 black crosses, wrote Dre. He pulled the lever. The world exploded in noise and violence. The canopy vanished with a deafening bang, ripped away by the 600 km/h slipstream. The wind blast was a physical hammer, punching the breath from his lungs, tearing at his clothing, threatening to rip him from the cockpit before he was ready. He fought against it, releasing his harness and pushing himself up. The screaming air clutched at him. He kicked free of the cockpit rim, tumbling into the chaotic void. For a second there was only violent, tumbling confusion. Sky, ground, the spinning shape of his dying Focke-Wulf whirling away, trailing a plume of black smoke. Then he pulled the D-ring on his chest. A jolt, like being grabbed by a giant, yanked him from his fall. The white silk canopy blossomed above him with a reassuring crack. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the shroud lines. He was swinging gently under the parachute, descending into a peaceful, pastoral scene that was utterly disconnected from the hell he had just escaped. He looked up. High above, the contrails of the American fighters scribed lazy circles in the blue. They weren't diving to strafe him. They were leaving. The hunt was over. He was beneath their notice, a piece of debris falling from a destroyed machine. The humiliation was more acute than any fear. He was a knight who had been unhorsed, his steed slain, left to walk home. The ground came up faster than he expected. He hit a plowed field, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He collapsed, tangled in the lines, the parachute silk settling over him like a shroud. For a long minute he just lay there, feeling the solid, unyielding earth beneath him, smelling the damp soil and crushed grass. He was alive. That was the single, overwhelming fact. Erich, Hartman, Bauer, they were not. He had led them into a slaughterhouse. He heard voices. French. Peasants were approaching from a nearby lane, their faces a mixture of curiosity and grim satisfaction. An older man in a worn jacket reached him first, not offering a hand, but looking down at him with cold eyes. Brant struggled to his feet, fumbling with the parachute harness. He was on enemy territory in occupied France. The locals were not friendly. His survival now depended on the German military police finding him before the resistance did. He was found 2 hours later by a Wehrmacht patrol, responding to reports of a parachute. They drove him in a Kubelwagen to a field command post, a requisitioned farmhouse humming with radio traffic. The atmosphere there was tense, a different kind of tension from the cockpit. It was the tension of a front line that was hardening, of an enemy whose strength was becoming palpable even on the ground. A harried-looking major from the local flak regiment took his initial report. Brant, still in his flight suit, smelling of oil and sweat, gave a terse account. Bounced by a large formation of P-47s, aircraft performance far superior to intelligence estimates, his swarm wiped out. The major's expression was one of weary skepticism. Superior performance, Oberleutnant. The Thunderbolt is a cow. You must have been jumped by Spitfires. They were Thunderbolts, Brant insisted, his voice flat. They outclimbed us. They outdove us. They turned with us, and there were so many of them. The major made a note, his pen scratching on the paper. I will forward your report to Luftwaffe liaison. Get some food. A transport will take you to your airfield tomorrow. That night, in a makeshift barracks smelling of damp wool and stale tobacco, Brant sat on a cot and replayed the engagement in his mind, frame by frame. The smooth, unified break of the American formation. The whistling scream. The Thunderbolt keeping pace in the climb. The casual, contemptuous wing waggle. The wall of aircraft emerging from the haze. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't bad luck. It was a systemic, overwhelming superiority. The reports from Hauser and Schneider had been precise, clinical truth, and they had been filed away as the excuses of stressed pilots. The captured P-47D near Bremen had revealed the technical secret, and that report had been buried under the weight of industrial impossibility. The entire chain of command, from the intelligence analysts in Berlin to the veteran pilots in the ready rooms, had conspired in a collective fiction of superiority. And today, the fiction had demanded its payment in blood. Erich Vogel, with his 22 kills and his quiet, dry humor, had paid. Young Bauer, on his 7th mission, eager to prove himself, had paid. Steady Hartman, a father of 2, had paid. Brant was the bill collector, the one who had to carry the receipt back to headquarters. The transport delivered him to his home airfield, a grass strip near Abbeville, the next afternoon. The place felt hollow. The familiar sounds of BMW radial engines being tested were absent. The dispersal hut seemed too quiet. He walked to the command hut, his footsteps loud on the gravel path. The Gruppenkommandeur, Major Friedrich Koenig, a bear of a man with a knight's cross with oak leaves, saw him enter and stood up from his desk. His face, usually ruddy and confident, was pale, the lines around his eyes deeply etched. Brant, thank God, we heard you were down. Koenig came around the desk, not offering a handshake but placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. Vogel, Hartman, Bauer. Brant shook his head once, a tight, mechanical movement. All gone, Herr Major, in less than 4 minutes. Koenig's hand fell away. He walked to the window, looking out at the empty hardstand where Rote Dre used to sit. Yours was not the only swarm, he said, his voice low. I sent up 8 aircraft yesterday on 2 separate patrols. 5 are missing. 2 came back shot to pieces. Only 1 returned unscathed. The same story, Thunderbolts, impossible numbers, impossible performance. He turned back, his eyes haunted. We lost 14 pilots and aircraft in 24 hours, Karl-Heinz. 14. In this one grupp. Do you know how long it takes to train a pilot to the level of Vogel or Hartmann now? Months we do not have. And the aircraft, they promise us 20 replacements by the end of the month. 20. We lost 14 in a day. Brandt said nothing. The numbers spoke for themselves. The calculus was simple and brutal. Write your report, Koenig said, gesturing to a desk. Put in every detail. The climb rate, the dive speed, the whistle, the numbers. I am compiling all the after-action reports from yesterday. I am sending them directly to Luftflotte 3 and to the General der Jagdflieger. Maybe now, when it comes from a commandeur with a stack of reports, they will listen. Brandt sat and wrote. He wrote for 2 hours, filling pages with precise, unemotional prose. He described the tactical scenario, the failed bounce, the energy states, the performance disparities. He concluded, the enemy fighter currently identified as the P-47D possesses a decisive advantage in all aspects of high-altitude performance over the FW-100 and 90 Amanus 8. This is not a matter of pilot skill, but of fundamental technical superiority. Furthermore, the enemy is able to deploy these aircraft in such numerical density that traditional tactical counters are rendered ineffective. The continued engagement under current conditions will result in the annihilation of the fighter arm in the West. He signed it, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Brandt, and handed it to Koenig. The major read it slowly, his lips moving slightly. He did not look up. This is a funeral notice, Brandt. It is an accurate report, Herr Major. Koenig filed it with a stack of others. They were not alone in their despair. Across northern France and the Low Countries, the same scene was playing out at dozens of Luftwaffe fighter bases. April 8, 1944, was not an anomaly. It was the first clear day of a new season of attrition. In the following week, the casualty reports would flood into headquarters, painting a picture of a hemorrhage that could not be staunched. On April 12, over Cologne, a formation of 350 B-17s was met by a force of 180 German fighters from multiple Geschwader. The Americans escorting them were P-51 Mustangs and P-47Ds of the new 8th Air Force fighter groups. The result was a massacre, but not of the bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 67 fighters shot down and 12 damaged beyond repair. The Americans lost 11 escort fighters, a kill ratio of 6-1. The narrative in the German after-action reports was unanimous. The escorts had fought aggressively, had pursued the German fighters all the way to the deck, and had performance that matched or exceeded their own at every altitude. On April 15, a desperate conference was convened at the headquarters of the General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland, in Berlin. Galland, a brilliant tactician and realist, faced a room full of senior staff officers and representatives from the technical office. He had the loss statistics projected on a wall. The line on the graph was not a gentle slope. It was a cliff. In the first 2 weeks of April, Galland stated, his voice icy, we have lost 287 single-engine fighters in the defense of the Reich and over France. Our confirmed kills of American escort fighters number 38, a ratio of 7.5 to 1. Gentlemen, we are not being defeated. We are being exterminated. A colonel from the technical office, a man named Ichterberg, cleared his throat. Herr General, the pilots are exaggerating. The stress of combat, the sheer numbers they face, it leads to perceptual errors. Our data on the P-47 has not changed. It cannot do what they claim. Galland slammed his hand on the table. Your data is obsolete, Colonel. It is a fantasy. I have pilots in the hospital, veterans with 100 victories, telling me they were outclimbed by a thunderbolt from 5,000 meters to 8,000 meters. I have wreckage reports. The Americans have a turbo supercharger. We have known this since January. What have you done about it? Ichterberg shifted uncomfortably. The technical challenges, the alloys for the turbine blades, the ducting, our industry is focused on the emergency fighter program. The Me-262 jet fighter is the future, not copying an American stopgap solution. "The Me-262 is not here," Gallen shouted. "The American stopgap is shooting down my pilots today. Tomorrow, every day. I need an answer for the next mission, not for next year." But there was no answer. The industrial disparity was the unspoken truth that hung over the room. The German aviation industry, under relentless bombardment, was struggling to produce 1,200 fighters of all types per month. In the first quarter of 1944, the United States had produced over 9,000 fighters. The P-47D line at Evansville, Indiana, was a river of aircraft. In the time it took a German technician to carefully hand-fit the engine cowling of a single FW-190, American workers on a moving production line had installed turbo-superchargers in 17 Thunderbolts. The perspective from other theaters confirmed this was not a localized problem. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots, masters of the lightweight, agile dogfighter, were encountering the same brutal shock. The American F-6F Hellcat, another product of overwhelming industrial design, was outperforming the legendary Zero at almost every altitude, while being massively more durable. A Zero could absorb only a few .50 caliber rounds before disintegrating. A Hellcat could return to its carrier with hundreds of holes. Japanese engineers examining down Hellcats were aghast at the weight of the aircraft, the thickness of its armor plate, the sheer robustness of its construction. It was the opposite of their design philosophy. It was, as one captured Japanese engineer later confessed in his diary, like comparing a samurai's katana to a sledgehammer. The katana is beautiful and deadly in a duel, but the sledgehammer will crush the katana, the samurai, and the wall behind him without discrimination. Back in Europe, the technological awe was mixed with a dawning sense of strategic doom. At a Heinkel plant deep underground, German engineers finally had a chance to dissect the turbo-supercharger from a P-47D that crash-landed relatively intact. Dr. Ernst Fischer, a senior propulsion specialist, led the examination. In a cold, concrete bunker lit by harsh electric lights, the massive unit sat on a workbench. Fischer and his team spent days measuring, sketching, testing materials. His report to the Air Ministry was a masterpiece of reluctant admiration. The General Electric Type C H-5 turbo supercharger represents a level of materials science and high-temperature engineering we currently cannot match in series production, he wrote. The turbine wheel is manufactured from a nickel-chromium alloy we have only begun to research in laboratory quantities. The bearing lubrication and cooling system is remarkably simple and effective, capable of operating at sustained temperatures that would seize our own designs within minutes. The integration into the airframe, while heavy and complex, is logically engineered for serviceability. Each unit is essentially identical, with interchangeable parts. This is not a hand-built prototype. This is a mass-produced component. Our assessment is that to develop and produce a comparable system for the BF-109 or FW-190 would require a minimum of 18 months, a complete redesign of the airframe, and access to raw materials we do not possess. The recommendation from the Bremen report in January was correct. It is also impossible. The report was stamped Geheim, secret, and filed. The truth was now officially recognized and officially deemed irrelevant to the war effort. The men at the front would have to fight with what they had. For Karl-Heinz Brandt, the war became a grim, unsustainable calculus. He was given a new aircraft, another FW-190 Ammonus 8, and assigned a new, inexperienced wingman, a boy of 19 named Fahman who had never seen combat. The missions continued, but the nature of the hunting had changed. They were no longer on Frey Jagd. They were interceptors, scrambling desperately to fend off waves of bombers, always watching the high escort for the inevitable bounce. The confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, fatalistic tension. The veterans in the ready room spoke less, smoked more. The jokes had dried up. They referred to the P-47s now as die-fail the arrows for the whistling sound they made in a dive. On May 12, 1944, Brandt's Group was ordered to intercept a massive formation of B-24 Liberators heading for the synthetic fuel plants at Merseburg. As they climbed, struggling to reach the bomber stream's altitude of 75 meters, they were hit by three separate groups of P-47s. The battle was not a duel, it was a rout. Brandt saw a FW-190 to his left simply disintegrate under the concentrated fire of four thunderbolts. He managed to fire a short, hopeless burst at a B-24 before a .50 caliber round shattered his canopy, sending plexiglass shards slicing across his cheek. His new wingman, Fahman, screamed over the radio once before going silent. Brandt dove away, his damaged aircraft trailing coolant, and made a forced landing in a field near Weimar. He had added no new crosses to his cockpit. He had only survived again. The impact on German strategy was immediate and catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's failure to stop the Allied bomber offensive had direct consequences. By June 1944, German synthetic fuel production had been reduced to 25% of its pre-raid capacity. Panzer divisions in France were training with limited fuel. The Luftwaffe itself was rationing aviation gasoline, curtailing pilot training and operational sorties. The air superiority that the P-47s and P-51s had won was not an abstract tactical advantage. It was the key that unlocked the next phase of the war. On June 6, 1944, as Allied landing craft churned towards the beaches of Normandy, the skies above were empty of the Luftwaffe. Where were the feared Jabos? Where was the Jagdwaffe? They were grounded, or so desperately outnumbered that their interventions were suicidal and futile. Of the 319 sorties flown by German fighters on D-Day, over 100 were shot down. They claimed 26 Allied aircraft. The air umbrella over the invasion fleet, woven from thousands of American and British fighters, was nearly impenetrable. The P-47s, in particular, excelled at the low-altitude ground attack role they were now free to perform, hunting tanks, trucks, and troop concentrations with devastating effect. The weapon designed for high-altitude escort had become the master of the battlefield below. For the German soldier on the ground in Normandy, the constant, demoralizing presence of the Jabos was a new and terrifying form of warfare. They called it Jabo Terror. A diary recovered from a dead Wehrmacht lieutenant read, "We cannot move by day. A single vehicle on a road brings the Jabos within minutes. They come so fast with that screaming whistle, and then the road is littered with burning wrecks. We are not fighting an army. We are being hunted by machines from the sky." The human cost for the Luftwaffe was a death spiral. The loss of experienced pilots was irreplaceable. In 1943, the average combat life of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot on the Western Front was 90 days. By the summer of 1944, it was 17 days. Training programs were slashed from 240 flight hours to 110, then to as low as 50. Boys were being sent into combat against American pilots who, though perhaps less individually experienced, were now part of a vast, well-oiled system of replacement and rotation. A German pilot who survived 50 missions was a rare veteran. An American pilot rotated home after 50 missions, to be replaced by another fresh pilot in a new aircraft. Karl-Heinz Brandt became one of those rare veterans, a ghost of the earlier war haunting the crumbling edifice of the Third Reich. By August 1944, he had 53 confirmed kills, but the last 12 had taken 8 months of constant combat to achieve. Each mission was a trauma. He was no longer the hunter in rote Dre. He was a survivor, flying with a permanent knot of dread in his stomach, his eyes perpetually scanning the high, sun-drenched sky for the telltale specks and contrails of the fail. On a mission to intercept fighter-bombers near Falaise in mid-August, his luck finally ran out. His swarm was bounced by a flight of P-47s from the 366th Fighter Group. In the ensuing melee, a 50 caliber round severed his elevator control cables. His FW-190 pitched down violently, uncontrollably. He fought the dead stick for a few seconds, then accepted the inevitable. He jettisoned the canopy and bilayed out for the second time in the war. This time, he did not land in friendly territory. He came down in the midst of the collapsing German front in the Falaise pocket. He was captured by advancing British troops within an hour, still in his flight suit, his face streaked with oil and blood from his old canopy wound. The war was over for Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Brandt. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in England. It was there, in the monotony of captivity, that the full scale of the industrial disparity became clear to him. The camp was near a major railway line. From his compound, he could see the trains passing, endless freight cars loaded with brand-new trucks, tanks, and aircraft parts, all painted in olive drab, all heading for the ports. One day, a group of American POWs arrived, bomber crewmen shot down over Germany. Brandt, who spoke some English, found himself talking to a navigator from Kansas. The American was curious about German fighters. Brandt described the FW-190's virtues. The American nodded, then said, "Yeah, I heard they're pretty good. Must be tough seeing so many of them get shot down." Brandt asked quietly, "How many of those Thunderbolts do you build?" The American shrugged. "I don't know the exact numbers, but my brother works at the Republic plant in Evansville. He says they have a new one rolling off the line every 45 minutes, 3 shifts a day. He said they built more jugs in the month of June than your whole Air Force shot down in the entire war." The statement was likely an exaggeration, but its essence was true. The numbers, when Brandt finally saw them after the war, were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts of all variants. The Luftwaffe and other Axis forces claimed approximately 1,234 P-47s shot down in air-to-air combat, a respectable number. But in that same period, P-47 pilots were credited with destroying over 4,879 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, a ratio of nearly 4:1. More tellingly, the Thunderbolt's impact went beyond air superiority. It had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, fired 60,000 rockets, and strafed countless trains, tanks, and troops. It was not just a fighter. It was a one-plane manifestation of American industrial and tactical doctrine. The final, crushing perspective came from the highest levels of the defeated Reich. In his interrogation after the war, Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commander of the Western Front, was asked about the critical factors in the Allied victory. He spoke of air power. The single greatest factor was the American long-range fighter, the P-51 and the P-47. They made it possible for the bombers to destroy our fuel supplies and our factories. But it was not just the aircraft. It was the numbers. We would design a countermeasure, a new tactic, a new weapon, and it might work for a week. Then we would see 200 of the enemy aircraft employing a new counter to our counter. We were not fighting an air force. We were fighting the entire output of the factories of Detroit and New York. It was a battle of craftsmanship against production, and production won. Karl-Heinz Brandt was released from captivity in 1947. He returned to a shattered Germany, a ghost in a broken landscape. He never flew again. He became an engineer, working on civilian aircraft projects, a quiet man who seldom spoke of the war. But sometimes on a clear day when the wind was right, he would hear a distant, high-pitched sound, a jet engine, a power tool, a train whistle. And for a fleeting instant he would be back at 8,000 meters over the channel, the cold biting through his gloves, the blue endless and empty, just before the world changed forever. He would remember the whistling scream, the silver blur in the dive, the wall of aircraft emerging from the haze, and the calm American voice on the radio. He had run home. He had told them what he saw, But by then, it was already too late. The future had arrived, not with a declaration, but with a demonic whistle and a storm of 50 caliber fire, delivered in such overwhelming numbers that defiance was not bravery, but suicide. The knights of the sky had been made obsolete not by better knights, but by the factory, the production line, and the relentless, impersonal logic of industrial might. His war, the war of the expert, the war of individual skill and courage, had ended that day in April. The war that followed was something else entirely, and it had only one possible ending.